Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm so pleased to see you all here. I am Jeff Fleming, Director of the Des Moines Arts Center, and it is our great pleasure to have you. In 2019, as I hope you have seen and participated in, the Fingerman Lecture, our ongoing lecture series, established and funded through the generosity of Lou and Lois Fingerman. Thank you, Lou and Lois. It's now in its 30th year, and this year we're focusing not on one lecture, but on 4 lectures by 4 U.S. museum directors. They are introducing topics and points of discussion related to the role of museums today, and certainly these include notions of inclusion and history. An example of this is our land acknowledgement statement that we sometimes use before public programs. The land on which we gather is the traditional ancestral land of the Native Americans who preceded us, and we honor those who are still with us. This afternoon, the Arts Center is honored to welcome Kevin Gover. He is the director of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, a position that he has held since December of 2007. He is also a citizen of the Pawnee Tribe of Oklahoma. Gover attended Princeton University, receiving his bachelor's degree in public and international affairs from the Woodrow Wilson School in 1978. Then he attended the University of New Mexico College of Law and received his Juris Doctor degree in 1981. Following law school, Gover established a small Native American-owned law firm that specialized in federal Indian law. Gover, Stinson, Wilson, and West PC grew into the largest Indian-owned firm in the country and represented tribes and tribal agencies in a dozen states. In 1997, Gover was nominated by President Clinton to serve as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of the Interior. And as the senior executive of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, he won praise for his efforts to rebuild long-neglected Indian schools and expand tribal and BIA police forces throughout the country. In 2003, he joined the faculty of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University and served on the faculty of the university's Indian Legal Program, one of the largest programs in the country. Please welcome now Kevin Gover.
All right, good afternoon. So I know after hearing that version of my biography, you must be thinking, how the heck did this guy become a museum director? That's a fair question. I ask myself that from time to time. The Smithsonian is a different kind of beast in a lot of ways. Yes, we are museums, and we're excellent museums. We have very broad responsibilities that really go beyond the presentation of material in the 4 walls of our various museums. For the National Museum of the American Indian, which was really the result of advocacy by Native Americans for a museum to celebrate the history and culture of Native people. Our museum, unlike others perhaps, had a particular set of constituents that we needed to be responsive to, whose support we desperately needed both for the financial support, but also for our very credibility as an institution. And so I think the thing that the Smithsonian high poobahs liked about my resume was that I have spent a career working with Native American tribes in very difficult, challenging situations at times. And the Smithsonian realized, perhaps, that it too needs someone to manage its relationship with the Native American tribes, particularly in the United States, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is when they're angry with you, they can really cause a lot of problems for an institution. And so that's my job, is really to manage that relationship And for a bonus, I get to also run a museum, which is a lot of fun. I tell people, you know, I did a lot of things before I came to the Smithsonian. And I'd like to think that they were important, representing tribes in litigation about big things like water rights and land rights and treaties, all that sort of thing. But I can honestly say that what we do at the National Museum of the American Indian is as important as anything I've ever been involved with. Because what we are trying to do is change what people know about Indians. And that is a challenge, because you'd like to think, we'd like to think, somebody would like to think, that people come to our museum as blank slates, that they don't know much about Indians, and they know they don't know much about Indians, and so they're there to learn and to really, from the beginning. But that's not true, of course. Everybody knows something about Indians. Some people know a lot, some people know a little, but unfortunately, much of what people know about Indians, they've learned either through their formal educational system or from popular culture. It's hard to say which is worse in terms of the accuracy of the material that we all learn from. And I say this in a very confident way because I experienced both of those things. And I grew up learning the same things that I suspect those of you in my age category, 45 or so, that I learned all the same things that you did, and in the same ways, and I believed them. And so that's a challenge, because we want to change that. We want people to have a real understanding of history, not just for the sake of history or even the sake of the truth, but because I believe very much that the greatest service my museum can provide for the tribal people of the United States is to basically level the playing field so that we're all working from the same sets of facts, so that decision makers 20, 30, 40 years from now don't enter into positions of power knowing so very little about the history of Native America, or worse yet, knowing things that are simply untrue. Now, and so that's what we dedicate ourselves to, and we do it in a variety of ways where we can actually be a lot of fun, believe it or not. One other thing I'd like to say, though, before I really dig in, museums enjoy an unusual place in American society right now. Museums are, if not the most trusted, certainly among the most trusted institutions in the country. We've seen other institutions' reputations suffer drastically in the last 30 or 40 years. And yet the public still regards museums with a real sense of respect, a willingness to believe that what they see in a museum is true, it's authoritative, it's well-researched, it's documented. And that's a precious place to be, and one that we have to take great care with. Now, let me also say that, like any of these other institutions whose reputations have suffered, that we could be subjected to the same kinds of attacks by certain segments for whatever their motivations might be. And it's only because people like you support these museums and would help us resist when attacked that I think our reputation has survived to this point and will allow it to continue to survive into the future. And in exchange, I will say for my museum and I think for the entire Smithsonian, and I think for most of the museum world, that we will continue to do our very best to be correct when we put something on the walls and say, we've done our homework, this is true, the things we are telling you is true. So with that, let's talk about some things that aren't so true. One of the first things we have to think about in working with our visitors, most of whom, by the way, are tourists, about 80% of our visitors are visiting DC, and they all say, when you go to DC, you go to the Smithsonian. Most of them don't realize that that's not one stop on your visit. And so quite often, we'll have a visitor who will say, I've only got one day, you know, and I'm going to see all the museums, and we just sort of smile and say, well, okay, you know. But we really, that is our audience, so we don't have much time to sort of grab onto people and help them learn something before they leave the building. And so we have to think about what is it that they do know and what do we need to help them understand better. Most important, though, is we never look down upon folks who don't know what is true, because I believe very deeply that any misunderstandings about the place of Native people in history, we all come by it honestly. We didn't set out to not know these things or to know the wrong things. Instead, they were taught to us. And that goes all the way to the top. So these untruths are mainstream. They are things we were all taught to believe that just aren't true. And so we have to be kind and generous in working with our visitors and going, well, you know, that's not quite the way it was. Let us show you. And so here's a good example. Now this is, this painting is called The Landing of Columbus. It is one of 8 large 18 feet by 24 feet paintings in the rotunda of the Capitol. The Capitol's about 300 yards from the front door of our museum. As you can see, it's depicting the landing of Columbus in the New World. This raises a number of ideas in our heads. First of all, Columbus never landed in North America, as we all know. Nevertheless, we've adopted this as part of sort of the national origin story. When we think of these grand paintings in the Capitol Rotunda, I think it's helpful to think of them as origin myths. This is our origin story. This is the story we tell ourselves about how our country came to be. And of course, we want to feel good about our country, and so we're going to give it sort of the tidiest version that we can of these events. So here's Columbus landing somewhere in the Bahamas. You'll see that the sailors look pretty darn fresh for having spent several weeks on a 15th century sailing ship, but it's a myth, and so of course they would look good. Now, we all know that Columbus discovered America. I know this because that's what my teachers told me. And yet there are those people over to your right, over in the corner of that painting. So there's at least a nod. A lot of these origin stories, as you might expect, include Indians, at least as bit players, sometimes as central figures, but more often as bit players. So here is Columbus bringing civilization and Christianity to the New World, and we see the Indians over in the corner cowering, perhaps, falling to their knees out of fright or perhaps awe at these newcomers. So, do we all know the Columbus song? In 1492, yeah, okay. So it wasn't just me, all right? Yeah. Why do we remember that? I haven't heard it played lately, right? Not on the radio, it's not even on, YouTube or Apple Music. Yeah, but we all remember it. So that gives you some sense of how powerful these things can get into our brains and just kind of stay there. So who would be surprised if a visitor came to us and said, hey, Columbus discovered America? Now, of course, what you don't see is how Columbus absolutely laid waste to the prosperous people of the Caribbean. Enslaved them, his men raped them, they literally worked them to death in many occasions, or they simply murdered them. So this is a key point. Why don't we hear anybody talking about that on Columbus Day? Or why haven't we heard that story in our history books? And we all, I think, know the reason, But my point is really this, that generation by generation, we choose somehow collectively. We choose as a culture what we're going to remember and what we're going to forget. And right now, the choice that is being made more and more throughout the country is we're going to remember what Columbus did besides find the Bahamas and what he did in the aftermath. And so I saw the other day something like 120 cities and towns have decided to no longer celebrate Columbus Day, and they're going to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day instead. So, and I'm really not here to endorse that, but I am here to endorse the conversation that was taking place in those communities that led to that decision, because it's very important that we do know and that we choose what our origin story is going to be, what we choose to basically form our identity as Americans. By the way, I'd like you to think about something while I'm talking, and that is, what is the origin myth of this area, of Iowa or the Des Moines area? What's your origin story for how this place came to be? And I'll quiz you at the end of the presentation. Here's another part of our origin story. This is the origin story from the part of the country I'm from, Virginia, or where I live now. This is the baptism of Pocahontas. Now, this is the founding myth of the Mid-Atlantic. If you walked into Alexandria, Virginia, and rolled a basketball down King Street, you would inevitably hit several people who claim to be descendants of Pocahontas. So there's a lot going on here, as you can see. There's this notion of conversion. Pocahontas became a Christian. Pocahontas, by the way, first of all, let me ask you, why are we talking 400 years after the fact? Why are we talking about a teenage Indian girl? And yet all of us know something about Pocahontas, right? So that's some staying power, man. I mean, I couldn't tell you who was king of England at that time, but I can tell you that that's when Pocahontas was alive. So that's really powerful. That is part of our American identity, and it's certainly a part of being a Virginian. So another thing to notice, remember this is a painting in the Capitol Rotunda, so this is how America is identifying itself when they were installed in 1840 to 1843. Pocahontas is a good Indian. Why is she a good Indian? Well, first of all, she's becoming a Christian. Fair enough. But why else is she a good Indian? Why was she invited to become a Christian? And the answer is that she assisted the advance of European civilization in the New World. In fact, without her, the Jamestown colony might well have not survived. But this makes Pocahontas a good Indian, and I'm going to show you how we like good Indians. We celebrate good Indians a lot. We also celebrate some bad Indians, which is weird, but we'll show you these good Indians like Pocahontas. This picture says that she chose the side of white civilization over her own people. She was such a good Indian that she saved John Smith from being executed by her father, Powhatan. So that's a great story, right? In fact, there's another part of the Capitol Rotunda that has this image. This is a frieze that's around the base of the rotunda inside the Capitol. And you know what's going on here? This is Pocahontas saving John Smith from being executed by her father, Powhatan. And I mean, this is really interesting, right? This is a story. This story is so important that it's in the one and only frieze in the Capitol Rotunda. And so surely it's true, right? Well, I know you're all saying, is it? Well, no, it's not true, probably. The only documentation of this event where Pocahontas intervenes to save him from execution is in a book that Smith himself wrote. And Smith was a bit of a fabulist. You wouldn't believe it, but he wrote another book about his travels in the Middle East, and wouldn't you know it, the very same thing happened to him there. So this guy was either very unlucky or he made it all up. So you choose. As with all good mythology, there's an element of this that is true. And see this right here? Everybody know what that is? Tobacco. Tobacco saved the Jamestown colony from total failure. And interestingly enough, it was Pocahontas' only child, Thomas Rolfe, who discovered this strain and brought it to Virginia. And so there's some truth in this depiction. And there's no doubting its importance in American history. This is another of those murals, the embarkation of the Pilgrims. Now, we all know the Pilgrims sailed for the New World seeking religious freedom. This, by the way, is the origin myth from where Lou and Lois come from. This is the origin myth of New England. So we all know that the Pilgrims sailed for the New World seeking religious freedom. And when they arrived, a friendly Indian, another good Indian, named Squanto, taught them how to grow corn. Then the Pilgrims had a big harvest, invited the Indians over for a great celebration, and that was the first Thanksgiving. We all know that story, right? There. That proves that it's true. So, you've all seen this image, right? It's in textbooks. I feel like I grew up with this. So, did it happen? Well, let's play, I'll give you our take from the NMAI.
All right. So, what is Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving is insane. It's this huge, incredible disaster on highways and airports, and it's crowded, and the weather's awful. A meal that takes days, sometimes weeks of preparation, emotional turmoil, fights. But the fact that it's a national holiday that really envelops everyone, it's a sense of the entire country in motion in a way that isn't really like any other day in American life. And the way it's corny, it's cartoonish and kitsch, is kind of a protective layer to sort of not get too direct about it. So underneath all those things, Thanksgiving is about trying to come to terms with this very difficult truth about the United States, that the country is a national project that came about at great expense to Native people. And it's not enough that we're a good country. We kind of have to be the best country, you know. But Native people and African slavery, those two things together, are huge challenges to how you process this. So eventually the country ended up deciding, you know what, we like the story about that meal at Plymouth a long, long time ago, in which these newly arrived people from England in this new country had their brunch in the forest with Indians. And what was that saying? That was saying that we're neighborly. We want this to work out. And we know it didn't all work out, but that's what we aspire to be. That's sort of our best selves.
Did that meal actually happen?
It happened, but nobody really cared. It wasn't like, oh, remember that time last November, let's have those folks over again, fire up the grill. Nobody thought that because it was just a thing that happened. But the Pilgrim folks there, they were writing letters or writing journals. They were like really meticulously detailing what was happening. But even that written account gets lost for basically 200 years and doesn't even emerge until the 1840s when this document is discovered again. And even then, it's not a big deal. It's actually in a footnote. And we remember that, we rescue it from being a footnote because that has meaning now. And so by the early 20th century, Indians are an indivisible part of what creates the United States. It's not a chapter that happened and it was bad and we got over it. Where in your head? Where in your pantry? Where in your garage? This imagery, representations, advertising, Thanksgiving says, however imperfectly we remember Indians, we're remembering Indians. And with all the problems with it, it's still a powerful idea, and it's still powerful to not Photoshop Indians out of the national narrative, to say, we're owning this. If there's a way that can open up ways to start thinking about it differently, opens up for people to become activists and try to change things, invent some new kind of Thanksgiving. Let's have the discussion. Let's see where that goes. But before you get to the lessons, I mean, is it right to use that? Is it whatever? I don't know. I guess if I were to put myself in terms of, this a cartoon Indian and all this at Thanksgiving, I'd probably be saying I'm glad to be here. Better than the alternative.
So that's a video that's in one of our newer exhibitions called Americans. And one of the things that we're trying to do in Americans is basically to indicate our sympathy to these sorts of understandings of American history, about Pocahontas, about Plymouth Rock, and say, yeah, we us too, we believe that too. By the way, pretty much every Indian I know loves Thanksgiving. And so both conceptually, but also just the holiday. I mean, it's a great time of year, and we all like it, except for the guys who show up at Plymouth Rock every year to protest the arrival of the Pilgrims. But both of the, one of the realities of our world and our lives is, we can grapple with two things at once that don't really seem all that consistent. So let me give you an example. About 40 years after that first Thanksgiving, which never happened again, there was one of the most devastating wars ever fought in North America between the Pilgrims and a number of the surrounding Indian nations, so much so that several of the Indian nations were absolutely wiped out. The leader of the native forces had been named King Philip by the Pilgrims. And when King Philip was captured, he was decapitated, and they posted his head on a spear at the entrance to Plymouth for 20 years thereafter. So you're not going to hear that in any of your Thanksgiving stories, right? You won't see it on Charlie Brown or any of those sorts of things. And so again, we're choosing what to remember and what to forget, even if we have to embellish a bit on what actually happened. So Thanksgiving disappears for 200 years, in essence, but at some point it became a useful story. It is a feel-good story, right? These refugees from religious persecution in Europe come to these shores and find peace and friendship with the natives, and the natives taught them to grow corn, and so it feels pretty good. And so the story about King Philip and King Philip's War, that doesn't make us feel so good. So we've chosen to put that aside for the moment. So these things, these images are pretty much everywhere, and that's one of the points of our Americans exhibition. So this is a mural in a high school in San Francisco. Good old liberal San Francisco, where everybody is equal in all ways. But this is on the wall of a high school, and actually a high school where most of the kids who are attending it are black and brown kids. As you can see, there's a dead Indian on the ground, and one wonders what fate awaits the guy on the right who's meeting with the pioneers. And George Washington himself is pointing the pioneers to the west. The rest of the mural looks like this, where it would appear that, that Washington is bargaining for the purchase of an African or African American enslaved person. I have a real problem with this because on the one hand, I'm not one of those who believes in destroying these things. I don't believe in destroying Confederate monuments. I think the monuments themselves are now part of our history. I do think that with a proper interpretation, we can understand the Confederate monuments differently than we have in the past. This, I've got to tell you, I'm not so sure. And the reason I'm not so sure is teenagers, you know, they're not going to read the label that we put on it. They're not going to necessarily dig into the interpretation and try to understand the history. But I'll bet you every brown and black kid that walks through by that mural is made to feel lesser, just by virtue of its existence there. So I think some images are just so overpowering that we shouldn't be exposing, especially young people, to it. But again, this is everywhere. In front of our museum in New York City, there are 4 sculptures by the same fellow who sculpted the Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in DC, Daniel Chester French. They are Europe, America, Asia, and Africa in front of the Custom House that we currently occupy. And if I just walked you past them in a moment, you would see that Africa and Asia are deeply insulted by the representation of who they are and who they were at that time in history. And of course, America and Europe were very positively portrayed in these things. So this kind of public art is really everywhere. And again, it's sort of like Columbus Day. I care much less about the outcome than I do about the conversation itself. And if we can properly interpret this material, get people to think about it, then it becomes, we can sort of take it in to our history and get comfortable with it. One of the most important things that I've heard for the past couple of years, we've been working on a National Native American Veterans Memorial. Congress directed us to build this, and good old Congress. They first passed the authorization in 1994, said build a memorial to teach all Americans about the powerful tradition of Native American service in the American Armed Forces. Said, but build it inside the museum. None of the other memorials are inside. And second, you can't use any of the federal money we give you. Oh, and you're not allowed to raise private money in order to build it. So it sat for almost 20 years with nothing happening. And, but, you know, Congress eventually does get it right. They took another look at the statute and they fixed it and said, okay, you can build it outside the museum and you can raise the money to do it. You still can't use your federal funds. But that's okay because all of the memorials now in DC are built with private funds. So given that, we said, okay, you know, we're ready to go, and we'll be opening that memorial on Veterans Day in 2020. But one of the veterans said something that was just so smart and so obvious that I felt silly for not having really thought of it myself. He said, you know, you can, because we'd ask him, why would you do this? Why would you go serve a country that you know broke its every promise to your people, that you know treated us very badly for so very long? And he just said, you know, first of all, it's still our country. And second, you can know these bad things about your country and still love your country. And I thought, you know, how obvious is that? How simple is that? And how powerfully true it is. So that's sort of the way I feel about this public art. Okay, so you see these ideas are mainstream. One of the things one of the ways people at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century got their information about Indians was from Wild West shows. This was more people went to Wild West shows than anything else they did in this country. More than they went to plays, more than they went to opera. All across the country, Wild West shows were the thing. And almost every one of these Wild West shows depicted the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now that's really interesting because that was a crushing defeat for the American military. And yet it has been absorbed into the national identity as kind of a good thing, right? Buffalo Bill's running around reenacting it to sell out crowds all across the country. So we're very curious about that. So this is the beginning of the Indian in the popular culture. By the way, this is how Plains Indians became, shall we say, the national mascot. You won't see, for the most part, other kinds of Indians, of which there were many, many, many more, used as mascots for high school football teams, for product sales, for to name your car after, all that kind of stuff, to name helicopters after. It was always Plains Indians, or Plains Indians with a certain look, of course, the headdress and mounted. So this is sort of how the Indian enters the national consciousness. This is what we're all supposed to look like. Here we have Plains Indians in the 1908 inaugural. This is Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration. And while to them, they thought they were going to Washington to engage with the government because they did that quite often, they ended up sort of being shown off. This is I don't know what it would be like, but it's like the conquered being required to march in celebration of their conquerors. And so this is what was happening in 1908. Okay, so popular culture. You all know who this is, or most of you do. By the way, I'm an enormous consumer of American popular culture. So when I make fun of these, I'm making fun of myself. So this is the Lone Ranger and Tonto. Again, we're talking about where people get their information about Indians. Now, what do we know about Tonto? He's a good Indian, right? He's a good Indian. Those other Indians, they don't get to stay on the show. They get dispatched after one episode. The good Indians get to stay. To the right, Michael Ansara with his hairy arms as Cochise. So somehow Cochise became a good Indian as well, and he appeared quite often. This is Daniel Boone and Mingo. Mingo was also a good Indian. Now, when I was growing up, do any of you, by any chance, remember the opening credits for Daniel Boone? Who could sing the song with me? Daniel Boone was a man, right? So in the opening credits, you see Fess Parker there with the coonskin cap. Fess Parker is loading his flintlock and he aims and fires. Saying, Daniel Boone was a man. And a deer falls. So they keep singing, was a big man. And then you see him reload and he fires again and kills an Indian. So every week, for several years, we see Daniel Boone shooting an Indian, shooting him dead, and then sort of smiling and, reloading his gun. I'm watching this and I'm going, I'm an Indian, right? I knew I was an Indian, even as a kid. And I'm thinking, well, what was it about us that made this okay? It must be okay, it's on television. And the teacher told me, that basically it was a good thing that non-Indian people came and took all of our land and then still let us stay, And so that's what got into my head, my little, 8-year-old brain. And I'll tell you something else. my mother was a white woman, my dad was an Indian. And these messages were so powerful that in trying to, and I was a smart kid. I made good grades in school, and I knew I was one of the smart kids in grade school. And I used to think, well, wait, I'm an Indian. I've learned in school that Indians aren't very smart. So how is it that I'm smart? Maybe it's because my mother's white. So that's how powerful these literally white supremacist messages are in the popular culture and, you know, in the classroom. So, you know, and what just kills me is the thought that my grandchildren are being exposed to the same kind of thing. And I know they are, because a couple of years ago, they had my grandson dressed up as a pioneer in a school play, you know, discovering gold in the Sierra Nevada. My daughter, because she had pretty much lost her mind and went down to the school. So they won't be doing that play again. But from the earliest days of the movies, this is how Indians were portrayed. A lot of the early movies were Westerns, and this was pretty much the theme. John Wayne. So I saw that The Searchers is going to be shown here soon. You should come see it. But these John Wayne movies are really funny. They're all shot in Monument Valley. And if you go to Monument Valley and talk to some of the Navajos who lived there or used to work on the movies, they tell a funny story. They say, well, John Ford would pay us to, you know, do a cavalry charge, come screaming and riding our horses. And he said you'd get, I forget what it was, $25 a day if you just rode your horse, but you'd get $50 a day if you'd fall off your horse like you got shot, right? So that's why when John Wayne would fire, 3 Indians would fall off their horse. See? So these things can be explained, and it's really... Okay, so these might be the most ubiquitous images about Indians in American culture, these mascots. And I don't know what to say about them, except as you see, you get my point about the Plains Indian being the only kind of Indian there is. And no one's beyond insult. The Chicago Blackhawks, so there really was a man, Black Hawk. And they've sort of taken that, and this sort of appropriation is kind of a stunning proposition, where a hockey team says, we can take that name and we can create a different image of who he was and sort of render him as what, a supporter of our hockey team, and completely denying him his importance in American history. Black Hawk led a rebellion against the Americans. Ultimately it failed, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion. And so when we hear these people saying they're honoring us with these sorts of things, it rings pretty hollow when we know that Black Hawk was real. The Washington football team, I grew up being called that name, and they weren't honoring me when they did that. It was an insult. It was a racial insult. We all understood that that's what it was. And by the way, where did they learn that word? From the movies. It was in the movies. Okay, formal education. So at the turn of the 20th century, these are the kinds of things being said openly in major textbooks. You can see a definitive analysis supporting white supremacy. Indians kind of caught a break for the most part, certainly compared to African and African American black people. So we were but little civilized, but we were beginning to develop a few industries that might be useful at some point in the future. So, and that was this sort of ranking, this racial hierarchy is a particularly weird thing. And yet, again, This was the state of knowledge at the time. This is what everybody believed, including people of color, because we were being taught the same thing. Similarly, these were some of the leading scholars in America writing about geography. North America was almost an empty continent, waiting for the white man to come and fill it with people. So I imagine, when I read this, 1916, my grandmother might have gone to school reading this book, my Comanche grandmother. And I wonder what she might have thought and whether, she had the resilience, the intellectual resilience to resist these kinds of ideas. But I don't know, and because I know that you heard, sort of how my little brain worked at that time. Imagine what this says to the brown kids, but also imagine what it says to the white kids, right? They must feel pretty empowered when they see this kind of material in a textbook. And it's very difficult. There's some good research showing that at a high school with an Indian mascot, when the mascot is performing, Native kids feel worse about themselves, but white kids feel better about themselves. So think about what's going on there when this sort of material is in front of you. Even today, they no longer sort of openly teach that outrageous sort of white supremacy, and yet the stories that they tell are pretty much the same ones that were being told in 1908, 1916, and thereafter. So the basic narrative hasn't changed a lot, and that's why you can have, I'm sure, a perfectly intelligent author of an American history textbook say, why do you think Americans were willing to give up new land to the Indians? It reminds me, it's everywhere. When I was at the Interior Department at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they had these WPA, Works Progress Administration, murals all throughout the Interior Headquarters building. And each of the major agencies was assigned a hallway, a suite of offices. So the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, they had guys building a dam. The National Park Service, had bears or something. And for the hallway where the Bureau of Indian Affairs resided, the major mural was of a white man teaching Indians to grow corn. I swear to God, that's true. So, again, I don't want to be too hard on the guy because somebody taught him that. Somebody taught him that's the way history proceeded, and that, non-Indians came here and helped Indians become civilized. It would have never occurred to him that it was native scientists who for centuries worked in order to develop corn or potatoes or the many other crops that native scientists developed over time and that now feed the world. And so, again, we have to be generous or at least not judgmental. And that's certainly the case for me because I believed it too. So, all right, I'm about to wrap it up. As a result of being taught this way, Americans continue to have some pretty strange ideas about Indians. And so the kind of video we're going to show now, I think, has particular resonance among natives and helps us to start to dispel some of these stereotypes.
I'm Native, but I'm not related to Pocahontas.
I'm Native, but I'm not a savage.
I'm Native, but I don't receive any casino money.
I'm Native, but I can't ride a horse.
I'm Native, but I don't wear beads and feathers. Okay, I do. I wear beads and feathers sometimes.
I'm Native, but I do not hunt my own food.
But I'm not qualified to wear a headdress.
But I don't live on a reservation.
But I did not live in the teepee.
But I don't wear war paint, unless it's Chanel red.
I'm Native, but Nothing. I just am.
I'm Native and I'm a digital media producer.
I'm Native and I live with depression.
I am Native and I am Christian.
I'm Native and I'm an actress.
I'm Native and I'm gay or two-spirit.
I have a doctorate from Harvard.
I'm a professional stand-up comedian.
And I'm a veteran of the U.S. Air Force.
I'm Native and I'm Filipino.
And I'm a huge Bowie fan.
And I am not mad at white people, unless you're a shitty driver. Then I hate you.
I'm Native and I'm proud to be a part of the Native community.
I'm Ojibwe.
A citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
I'm of the Lakota tribe.
Kiowa in Wichita.
Muskogee Creek Nation.
Ipai Indian.
Paiute Yurok Indian.
We are Native and we are still here, obviously.
So these sorts of, this material is aimed at teenagers, basically. And I'll tell you that I have nothing but good feelings about how issues like this are going to proceed over the long run, because these young people have much different attitudes about this than my peers did. They're much less susceptible to stereotypes, and so, you know, that I believe, I was reading the other day, 78% of college students believe that we should do away with Columbus Day. There's no way that would have happened. It wouldn't have been anything like that in my generation. But it means that they are learning the truth, or at least they're not being exposed to a very powerful set of untruths. And so it's changing, and it's changing pretty fast. When I was a kid, Custer was a hero. I remember reading a book and just feeling really sorry for Custer, you know, because he and his brothers were killed by these really bad Indians. And then, you know, 40 years later, okay, 50 years later, he's not a hero anymore, and not in the popular culture, and not in the historical literature. And so it does change. It does change. It continually changes. And I think we should feel good about that and be aware that we are choosing at all times the stories that we're going to believe and choosing what we're not going to talk about. This last image, sorry about that, that is Osceola, the mascot for Florida State University. Osceola enjoys a special exemption because it just so happens that the Florida Seminole tribe, is willing to permit this to happen. I wish they had chosen differently. And this is actually Osceola, who fought a long series of wars against the United States, was finally betrayed and captured eventually, but never, ever surrendered to the United States. And his people are still down there in Florida doing their thing. So let me just finish one other story just because I like it so much, and then we'll stop. So remember Pocahontas. About, like I said, she's had a 400-year career. I mean, that's pretty dramatic. But a part of that career was back in the 1920s, the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, excuse me, I get called out for that all the time. The Commonwealth of Virginia was perfecting its Jim Crow laws. And of course, it had a law prohibiting interracial marriage, miscegenation, they call it. And so they also had adopted what we know as the one-drop rule, that if you have any African ancestry, any Asian ancestry, any Native ancestry at all, one drop of that kind of blood, then you are colored. There are only two kinds of people under Virginia law at that time: white people, colored people. Well, they all thought that was a pretty fine rule until somebody must have pointed out, I would love to have been in this room. Somebody said, you know, most of the first families of Virginia worked very hard for a very long time to establish that they were descendants of Pocahontas. They issued certificates and everything to say that you are part of the club, you are an uber Virginian, you are descended from Pocahontas. And so that kind of screwed everything up to make all those first families colored, right? But they were very clever, and somebody said, I've got an idea. Let's pass a rule that says, well, if you're 1/16 or less Indian, then you can still be a white person. And that's what they did. And it was known as the Pocahontas Exception. So, 40 years later, Mildred Loving and her husband Richard decide to challenge these laws against interracial marriage in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they succeeded. And the Supreme Court ruled in Loving against Virginia that these laws were unconstitutional, and that, of course, people of different races were allowed to marry each other all across the United States. This was only about 1967. It was in 1971 that my parents moved to Virginia, lived in Virginia, to do their jobs in Washington. That was only 4 years later that their marriage would have been illegal in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But what's really interesting to me is that when Mildred Loving passed away, everybody knew who she was. She got a New York Times obituary. But in the New York Times obituary, it said she was a Rappahannock Indian. And so, and that made sense. She was from that part of the country, the Rappahannock drainage. Black people, white people, Indian people had been cohabiting, shall we say, for a very long time in that part of the world. And so it was certainly possible, perhaps even likely, that she was in fact descended from the native people of that part of the country. And so, and I just sort of like to think that maybe she was in fact a descendant or a relative of Pocahontas. So, so these stories, I don't want you to hear me saying they're stupid or they're dumb or nobody should believe this. They're telling us something about ourselves, but they should not be taken literally. And so we should always pause and say, okay, that's a good story. Now I wonder why they tell it that way, and I wonder what they're leaving out. And it's that what they're leaving out, I think, is where the really rich material is. Because if there was in fact a connection between Pocahontas and Mildred Loving, man, that's a grand story, and one that you could tell much of American history through the eyes of just the people in that line or in that region. And there's no one version of history that is entirely correct. Every American story, every major American story, can be told from a number of perspectives. And so that's what I always say to my staff. We're telling stories through native eyes, but there are other ways to tell them that are equally valid. And when we begin to try to put all that together, as we're trying to do at the Smithsonian with all these different museums, you can end up with something just spectacularly rich. And yeah, it's messy and it's confusing and sometimes it's pretty ugly. But I guarantee you that these more complex stories are much richer, much more heroic than the stories as we learn them. And so that's why we should try to learn them and question them and decide what we choose to forget and what we choose to remember. So I'm going to stop there and see if anyone might have a question for me. I only answer easy questions, so.
And per usual, we have microphones on either side of the aisles, and if you'll raise your hand, either myself or Kara will come to you, and Kevin will try to let you know where the lecture or where the question's coming from so you know where to look.
Okay.
Right, start up here.
Hi, thank you very much. Great talk. And you started the talk by saying that a lot of what you learned was from popular culture, and that's still happening, especially with the internet. And my question has two parts. One, have you seen recently, I'm from the Jewish community, and we've seen a lot of anti-Semitism. Have you seen recently an uptick in the anti-Native American activities? And then the other question is, because we learn so much from pop culture, do you think that pop culture could swing too far in the other direction than what historically it was? And thank you for a great lecture.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know that I've seen an uptick. I think that we all know that things are very bad for the Native people in certain parts of the country. And we don't see that it's getting any worse. But so I don't think that. And can we swing too far in the other direction? I think the common, refrain is that's too much political correctness. Yeah, I think you can. I think you can be just as stupid and just as out to sort of whitewash history from the other perspective as well. I'll give you a good example. It is true that Columbus introduced African slavery to the New World. It is not true that Columbus introduced slavery in the New World. So Indians were just as capable of enslaving those who were not like them, meaning in this case other Indian nations, as were the Europeans. It seems to be a part of the human condition. So if you ever read that, well, Indians never enslaved anybody, or, well, yeah, they enslaved Africans, like the 5 civilized tribes did, but they were nicer to their slaves. Well, that's nonsense, right? So yeah, if I'm going to sit here and tell you, look for the truth, I have the same obligation to do that, even when it is not flattering to people like me. Yeah.
Mr. Maya.
Thanks so much for coming, by the way. Appreciate it very much, too. And I'm thinking, in terms of your mission, your challenge that you face ahead, as you were talking about Iowa and our backgrounds, I was kind of remarking to myself that it's been 50 years since Vine Deloria published Custer Died for Your Sins. Vine took his first degree up the road at Iowa State University.
I didn't know that.
He did, yes, and it was in engineering and mechanical science. But I wondered about how you see your mission ahead. What is one of the hardest things in terms of presenting what I would and others have termed a counter-narrative to what you've been laying out? I mean, visitors coming, they have, the tourists you mentioned, one day I'm going to try and see it all. So can you give us a sense of what your focus will be in the future at the Smithsonian in terms of how do you reach that tourist, others who perhaps have never heard of Vine and the work of so many others? His is just one contribution.
Yeah.
Gerald Visner, others.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're a museum, right? And so we always have to concern ourselves with what's in the exhibition galleries. But it's now absolutely clear to us that the place where we can have the most impact is in the classrooms. And so we sit here complaining about, geez, can you believe this junk that's being taught to students across the country? Well, we've decided to stop complaining and start producing our own material for use by teachers. Teachers, don't have the... teachers have lots to do, and they don't have time to go chase down what is not in this textbook and what is untrue in this textbook. As I said at the beginning, museums have extraordinary credibility, and that's particularly true with teachers, and it's particularly true with the Smithsonian Institution. And so, in addition to our collections and the people who work at my museum, probably our most important asset is the Smithsonian brand. And we intend to use that brand to get ourselves into classrooms across the country and provide material to teachers that they can use, and so the kind of stuff that we were looking at won't be taught any longer. So I think that's probably the most important thing we're doing right now.
Was there a follow-up question, Mr. Amaya? No. Did you have your hand up? No? Okay. Do I see a question here in the middle? Okay, I'm coming over.
Hi, my name's Andrea. I worked with Leonard Littlefinger out at the Oglala Lakota Reservation for a long time in Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And one of the things that he preached was the natives healing themselves and understanding that what happened to them a long time ago was something that they needed to heal within. And one of the things that he did was getting his great-grandfather's hair back from the museum.
Yeah.
But it took him like 15 years.
Yeah.
And he died about 2 years after he finally was able to get the hair back, which is a significant issue with the Lakota people when burying their loved ones. When you're looking at trying to work between reconciliation between a history in which they're still living in the same place that Wounded Knee occurred, and the fact that museums hold the artifacts of their loved ones' bodies, and they need them in order to move on, how do you decide and how do you move on without losing the historical, or can you? The historical part about teaching others about what we did as a society, but then allowing the native cultures to heal.
I don't think there's any scientific or historical value in those human remains, and I think they should be returned. Our museum has already returned all of the remains we can identify with only a few exceptions, and those exceptions are where it's unclear which tribe should receive them. But just as a philosophical matter, we don't want human remains in our collection. Human remains of anybody, you know, Indians, non-Indians, anybody. I've never heard a good, especially for when the source of those remains is known, I've never heard a good explanation why they're of any scientific or historical value. And certainly, whatever value they might have can't possibly outweigh their value for the reasons you were just describing in their home communities. We feel so strongly about this, it goes well beyond human remains. You know, anything we're required, by the way, this isn't an act of generosity, we're required to return human remains whenever we can identify them. We're required to return anything that was taken from graves, at least in North America. We're required to return sacred objects, and we're required to return cultural patrimony in response to claims from tribes. And so we do that. We have an active repatriation program. Other museums are sometimes for okay reasons and sometimes not, more reluctant to return those. I don't have an answer for you how you can move past that. I don't think you can. There are remains from my tribe all over Europe, and they're trying to get them back because there was this lively trade among the museums of the world in Indian bodies for a long time. And a lot of Indians went touring with, among others, Buffalo Bill in Europe, and they would die over there, probably because they were exposed to, you know, these new and different viruses that existed there. And they ended up in museums all over Europe. In some cases, just grotesquely, there's a Pawnee named White Fox, and they skinned him when he died in Europe, and then stuffed the skin and put it on display for a long time. They finally took it down. We're all appalled, right? But that was not unusual in the early 1900s. It was being done at museums all across this country as well. So museums have a lot to answer for, but I think it's just, it doesn't require a lot of thought to say these things need to be returned if the tribes want them back.
I have another museum practice question. When you get something out of the storage that you haven't used for a while, is there ever a policy of going back to see how confident are we that we're telling the story that is appropriate for here, or is this what we think it is? Is there a lot of research that is done kind of retroactively at this point, trying to increase your confidence in what you're saying?
Yes, and we still make mistakes. My favorite is we had this, it was a blouse of some kind, and so, you know, the curators very proudly created this exhibition and wanted this blouse in it. They put it on, you know, one of those forms to show what it was. And somebody from that particular tribe came in and said, "Oh, well, that's very nice, but you put it on backwards." So, you know, that's a curatorial nightmare, right? But yes, we do a lot of research, and the most important research we do is to inquire of the tribes. Is this what we think it is? Is this what our records say it is? And we actually like to have them come to our collections facility and just get in there themselves, because they're constantly correcting our records and saying, "No, that's not what that is." And so it's of enormous value to us when they come to visit the things in our collections. Yeah. By the way, we're not unique in that respect. Museums all over the country have learned that that's the only appropriate way to work with this material. And so I'd like to think that the National Museum of the American Indian had a lot to do with that, because they very specifically and aggressively empowered Indian tribes and communities to set the course in the interpretation of this material. And but I think it just sort of hurried a trend that was already underway. And so museums all over the country are working much differently than they did a generation ago. Not so much in Europe, by the way. Europeans stole it fair and square, and they're just not gonna give it back.
We have a question down in the front. Kara's heading over to you.
Thank you for coming with us this afternoon to our little town between two rivers. It's a rare honor for someone of your caliber to come talk to us all.
Please. What do you want?
Okay, I deserve that. But a lot of people in this state don't know any Native Americans personally. There's a lot of very small towns that are very homogenous.
Yeah.
What can we do to be better allies to these groups of people if we don't even know any at the moment?
Yeah, you know, that's where that's why I think these educational materials are so important, because we don't just want them out there for the big cities. We want kids everywhere to be seeing the same things. And so, is that an answer to your question? I don't see the rural communities really as being any different, except that perhaps they're a little less likely to know Indians. But you know, most Indians are rural too. So I think I make no assumptions about the fact that a community is rural in evaluating their knowledge of Indians. Yeah. All right, have I worn you out?
I think perhaps. Well, this has been a tremendous hour that we've spent with you. Thank you very much, Mr. Gover.
Welcome.